The final of the three artifacts and commitments we're going to look at is the increment and definition of done. So far, we've covered the product backlog with its commitment, the product goal, and the sprint backlog with its commitment, the sprint goal. The culmination of every sprint, though, is the increment. It is the cumulative delivery and value that the Scrum team work towards every sprint. Importantly, multiple increments can be produced every sprint. It does not have to be limited to one. But the thing to know is that increments are cumulative, i.e. they are built on top of one another. So there may be multiple improvements released every sprint, however there is only ever one increment at a point in time. Imagine this is like a large Lego building. If you added another 2 or 3 bricks, you wouldn't say it was a new building. It is the same with the increment. It's the same increment you had before, but now it has been improved. If you remember when we talked about the product goal, the strategic step that was needed to move the product forwards, the sprint goal was the tactical step in order to achieve this. Continuing in the same thread, the increment is the concrete stepping stone that is the materialization of the sprint goal. What I mean by that is that the increment is something done that is inspectable to determine whether the Scrum team have moved further towards the product goal. Although we'll talk about it more later in this series of videos, the increment is what is presented at the sprint review event. It is an artifact designed to elicit feedback and gather evidence that can be used by the product owner to make decisions about what to focus on next. Notably that in order to gather this evidence, the increment that is presented to stakeholders and users must be usable. We don't show work that isn't done. A user can't inspect a half-finished increment because there are too many unknowns for them. Therefore, Scrum is very clear that the increment must constantly be in a usable state in order to support empiricism. Now, I mentioned that the increment is presented at the sprint review, and that is true. However, there is no need to wait until the sprint review in order to deliver an increment to stakeholders. It can be delivered at any point of a sprint. The reason why this is so important is that the sprint review should never be considered a roadblock, something preventing value from being delivered to the stakeholders. As the Scrum Guide puts it, the sprint review should never be considered a gate to releasing value. In order to ensure that the increment is constantly in a usable state, the developers conform to the commitment of the definition of done. It is a formal description of the increment and therefore the product when it meets the quality measures defined within it. These quality measures, in the form of the definition of done, are created by the Scrum team itself where the organization they work with does not have a standardized one. This concept can be a little bit hard for people to understand sometimes. However, all this point is saying is that if the wider organization have a minimum standard for a product they release, that must be included as a minimum within the Scrum team's definition of done. Some examples of these might be a certain color brand kit must be used. The logo should always be used in the bottom right-hand corner, or full release notes are made available. If an organization definition of done exists, as I said, the Scrum team must incorporate this into their own. But where the organization do not have one, the Scrum team will create their own from scratch. Now, because product backlog items are individual and independent pieces of value, as soon as a product backlog item meets the definition of done, it can be said that an increment is born. This is because we have a usable, useful, and potentially releasable piece of value to validate with our stakeholders. Commonly, product backlog items are bundled together into larger increments for release. However, as long as the product backlog items meet the definition of done, it is considered a usable increment in its own right. The definition of done can be referred to as a common language of inspection. This is because it creates transparency amongst the entire Scrum team and organization and a shared understanding of the quality of the increment. Importantly, if an increment does not meet the definition of done, it cannot be released or even presented to stakeholders during the sprint review. Product backlog items that do not meet the definition of done by the end of a sprint are returned to the product backlog for future ordering and sizing as appropriate. In this way, the definition of done protects the product by ensuring that only quality increments are released. Just a quick tip from me, if you choose to ignore your definition of done once, you'll do it again. And tightening quality is a lot harder than lowering it. If you're wondering what a definition of done might look like, consider any product in front of you right now. And I want you to try a small activity. Look at anything in your room that is a product and write a list of at least 5 quality descriptors that you would expect the company who produced that product to adhere to. When we come back, the example I'm going to use is a computer keyboard, so pause your video now. So, I said I was going to use the example of a computer keyboard, and I will. But before we get to that, let's consider who cares about the definition of done. There are two stakeholders to the definition of done: the organization, in that it is a product they are producing, and also the users of the product. Those two stakeholders care about different things. But whilst the criteria that are contained within the definition of done that covers both of those stakeholders are important, I would suggest that you remember the user's needs at all times. So back to our keyboard. Some of the things I might expect to see in the definition of done for a keyboard are: all keys are tested and working. The lettering is appropriate to the UK market. There are no scratches or dents in the plastic production. The electrical safety of the product has been tested. Those are the things that I, as a user, probably care about. But remember, the definition of done does not just apply to users, it applies to the whole product. So you might reasonably expect to also see in the definition of done, the keyboard user guide has been updated. All components used in the building of the keyboard are sourced ethically. The logo is present on the product. When all of these criteria are put together, you have the definition of done. Now, the criteria contained within your definition of done that I've been talking about is not fixed. It evolves over time. As we gather more evidence about what is needed by our users, our definition of done tightens and improves. It never gets weaker. The definition of done is commonly inspected and adapted in the sprint retrospective. Importantly though, we can all set a golden standard for our product, the perfection. But there is always a trade-off with our skill set. What are we actually able to do? And what is worth doing? Think about a high-end versus a basic hotel room. I can imagine a definition of done that is a little bit tighter for a high-end room, but I guarantee that it will also be more expensive, and it's the same for your product. The definition of done is also controlled by the expectation of your users and what they're willing to pay. If I had to summarize this video into 2 points, it would be these. Firstly, the definition of done must be conformed to consistently. No product is ever released without meeting it. I know it's easy to say just this once, but believe me, over time, your product will become less stable and harder to fix. And secondly, the increment is the vehicle we use to gather feedback from our users, treat it carefully and respectfully, and present it at least during the sprint review to support empiricism. If you're a technical team and you're thinking, well, they won't be interested in seeing our code, you may be right, but perhaps you could show them a diagram of implementation or a short demonstration of an end-to-end process, or even feedback from customers showing they love what you've done. Don't hide away your increment. Be proud of it and gather feedback to improve it.